Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Articulating Insight podcast, the podcast where I talk to interesting and creative people from around the internet about the foundational principles of art, mainly through film and music conversations. Although we haven't talked about music that much in the past couple episodes, but it'll happen. It'll happen, I swear. Anyway, today I had Jay on from the YouTube channel Style is Substance, which if you haven't seen, I would highly recommend it because it is absolutely one of the most insightful and interesting film analysis and critique channels out there. And Jay's always got this super informative and interesting perspective to any film they tackle, and it's just awesome to watch. So I mean, obviously, go check it out and just see what films you're interested in that they've done videos on, and yeah, go check that out because it's awesome. In the episode today, we do, again, get very specific with our discussions in this episode, particularly with our conversations about Salò, Funeral Parade of Roses, and even our Soul conversation. So if those films don't really interest you or you're unfamiliar with them, I would still highly recommend sticking this episode out because near the end, we have a very broad and important conversation about what it means to be conscious in art creation and art engagement that I think is widely applicable and is really the type of conversation I made this podcast for. So please stick it out for that because I think it's just an amazing conversation. And that's not to talk down on any of the conversations we have before, because there is a lot of great insight in this episode about the preconceptions regarding children's films I think a lot of people have, and also just different matters of critique that are so important. I just think it wraps up super nicely. So, just saying, if you ever think it's oh, I've probably heard it all. No, you haven't. You're not ready for those final moments, or whatever. Anyway, Jay was a fantastic guest overall, and I think the podcast really just flows beautifully right to the end. This episode, and some of the concepts we cover, does continue a bit on some of the notions discussed in the last episode, which was the Your Cult Boyfriend conversation, particularly in terms of what it means to engage with children's films and the difference between looking at a work on an individual internalized perspective versus viewing it in the wider cultural context. I think in my ruminations since last episode, I have decided that I do want to continue supporting children's films like Pixar movies and stuff like that, because to me, to articulate sentiments that I can internalize constructively and I think are presented in a conducive way is worth supporting. And I think in this episode, we really get into the nitty-gritty justifications of why. And I think there's some really great moments that we have during our Soul conversation, and even a bit of our Mitchells versus the Machines conversation, that do lead to a kind of an epiphany I had in this episode, particularly where I mentioned 200 years from now and stuff. I won't get into it now because you're going to hear it soon. But yeah, I think those moments were actually a big breakthrough for me in understanding why it's all right to support these films and what they can actually serve, to people. Another thing we talk about is the film Funeral Parade of Roses, which I feel bad because I was a little ill-prepared to talk about it here, even though I should have known it would come up, and I think I'm the one who brings it up anyway, which is kind of funny. But yeah, I don't really get into my qualms in the film in a very nuanced way, and if you're interested in my further take in the movie, my review of it on Letterboxd is a much more articulate condensation of my thoughts in it. But I just feel like the methods of articulation that they use for that film is not conducive to the really sensitive and important topics that they bring up. And I just feel like, to me, it felt like an insensitive work in that regard. But, I mean, obviously that's my perspective. Jay has an amazing video about it. And they do a great job defending the film in this episode, and I can see their perspective where they're coming from. I just don't think it's quite conducive to how I engage with films. But that's just a base level difference, and I'm so glad of Jade to hash it out without getting defensive or anything, about me kind of absentmindedly attacking a film that I know that they have a lot of passion for. So I'm so glad for Jay being just really open here and having a great conversation, and that applies to everything here. We have so many great places that you can tell we both get really amped up this episode. There's some parts where we're just kind of jumping over each other to answer certain things, and that's awesome. I love it. It's such an open, engaging conversation on both sides here, and yeah, I had a great time recording it. I had a great time editing it, and I hope you guys will enjoy it too. So, without too much further ado, I present to you the Style to Substance J conversation on articulating insight. I hope you enjoy.
Well, see, the thing is, when it comes to like what art is, right now, I think to me, it's hard for me to like think too selfishly because I guess I just have this tendency to just view it as kind of like this cultural thing, right? Or not even just a cultural thing, but sort of like I mean, as far as we know, just worldly thing, where like cross-cultural, like it's almost like, and in a lot of ways, I think that culture cannot survive without art. Even though arguably you could argue the antithesis where like that culture itself is actually destroyed by art. But I don't know how true that is. I just don't know. I mean, like if you think back to even like, the earliest human civilizations, they would have written like on like cave walls, right? Like pictures of themselves. So so there's like this, I feel like there is like this human need, if not of expression, at least of representation
Mm-hmm.
of human social interactions, and also like people have this tendency where they want to record things, they want to record history, and but sometimes like if you think about kind of like like the ancient Greeks, they didn't necessarily just want to record history, but they wanted to also sort of like in the process like present like this really propagandic like view of themselves, right? Where they would be like presenting themselves in such a way where as time went on, people would continue to like look fondly upon them. So like that's kind of how like a lot of myths are made, where it's not, they want to say like, oh yes, I'm a descendant of a god. They, at the given time, like there may have been some like level of like belief in that, but it was exaggerated and then kind of like for it to carry on throughout each generation. So I think like in a lot of ways, art is kind of like telling a story in that sense. And also a documentation of a given time period, a given like culture, individual experiences. It's all sorts of different things. And then even from an architectural standpoint, that's very much like an establishment of what like this group of people what they are, right? What they are in where they're going, where they're from. So a lot of it is like people take pride in themselves based off of like, like at least traditionally based off of kind of like their lineage, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's not just like from like kind of a not just from like in a sense of blood, but also just like in a sense of culture.
Mm-hmm.
And in a lot of ways that can kind of lead to sort of kind of like ethnocentric and kind of like instead of nationalistic like viewpoints, but that is ultimately I think how history is built in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as like art goes, and I'm guessing that here you kind of want to talk more about films, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
more specifically.
Yeah, mostly, yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know how much I really have to say about like music. I'm sure I have some things, but like, well actually that's a good point of distinction there, because like I think with music, I have a tendency, and maybe this is sort of naive, but also maybe it's just kind of like just how I'm built, at least at the current moment. I'm sure if I like read into like music theory, I could appreciate like music in a more deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of as it sits right now, I'd just like to like play songs and listen to them and then kind of and do as minimal amount of like research about them as possible,
Mm-hmm.
because I like to kind of isolate. I view music as an escape, but at the same time, I do acknowledge that people look at music a little more intellectually than I tend to, and that's totally valid, and I would encourage it, because I think like so long as you're interested in doing so, because in a lot of ways I know that the way that I look at films, and maybe the way I look at films kind of like it can be quite intense, right? And sometimes it can like drop that more intimate aspect of it,
Mm-hmm.
of my own like personal engagement with the work, because I just find like the art form so fascinating. So I look into that, but then when you the more you know, kind of like the phrase is like the ignorance is bliss, right? But
Mm.
like the more you look into like like a certain subject matter, kind of like the more you know and the more you can appreciate something. But at the same time, that can also be at the cost of being able to really get into that mindset of escapism.
Mhm.
As I do think there is an important aspect of that. So that's kind of how I separate like film and music. I'm not necessarily like that musically talented, and that's kind of one. But I feel like I have some kind of creative like drive that's a bit, and I'm a very visual kind of like learner and storyteller. So I think like in a lot of ways like film, I am drawn to it in ways that I'm not really drawn to music. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And like I know that some people think I can be like a little elitist, but when it comes to film, and maybe there's some truth to that, but at the same time, like I do acknowledge like yeah, if somebody just wants to like watch like a movie in the same way they like to get on a roller coaster, I don't think that's really that bad, honestly, because I don't really think it's bad for people to look towards things as escapism. I had this friend of mine who like we would go to like this art gallery together, and she'd look at like paintings and she would cry. She would, the tears would be pouring from her eye sockets, and she'd be sitting there like looking at these or standing there looking at these paintings, and really kind of connecting with them. And you know what she'd do right after going to the art museum?
Mm.
Hey, do you want to go to the movie theater and watch Detective Pikachu?
Let's go.
Yeah, so like in a very kind of like superficial way,
Mhm.
and that's totally fine though because at least but I was struck by that because in a lot of ways like you can there are many different ways to engage with something, and I don't necessarily think there is like really one right way beyond like kind of what it means to the individual. But at the same time, I think that people have sometimes some people have a tendency to voice their opinions on something, and it's totally fair to voice their opinions, but the opinions that they're voiced would be kind of like very essentialist, very like absolute, like this is how it is, this is what objective quality in a work of art looks like.
Mhm.
Or I'm kind of more thinking about films in this respect. And I think sometimes like they just don't know what they're talking about.
Mhm.
And I think like it's good to kind of sort of break that, or where it's like they kind of like adhere to this kind of like cultural canon, where it's like these are the films that everybody say are great, so they are objectively great, but that's not really how it works.
Mhm.
But then at the same time, also people that kind of like say that their subjective opinion is kind of like the most valid way. It's like, yes, but I think it's also sort of important to kind of understand where the collective consensus is coming from. And that's kind of what I start doing with my videos on my YouTube channel, Style of Substance. I try to, lately I've been kind of like looking at like certain conversations that people have about a given work. And sort of like, and what I tend to see when it comes to something like Blade Runner, I made this video about a contentious scene in it. People will talk past each other in a lot of ways, but then sometimes they sort of find some kind of alignment. But ultimately, what I see when it comes to like controversial topics, what one person says and what another person says may be very kind of like at odds with each other. But I think that there's still there's validity to both sides of the way that they're approaching this piece of art. But at the same time, what I've noticed is that the arguments that they get into oftentimes aren't really articulated all that well.
Mhm.
And so what I kind of would like to see is kind of like evaluate like what is this discussion that's being had about something like Blade Runner or The Silence of the Lambs. But I like looking at like these conversations because I feel like, hey, there's an interesting discussion to be had, and people are like coming close to getting there, but they're really beating around the bush, and they're not really trying to understand the other side and then kind of come to a educated conclusion based off of whatever. Because you can look at something like The Silence of the Lambs. I think it's a great movie. But like kind of the argument that I was like kind of like engaging with is like whether or not the film is transphobic.
Mm.
And I looked at it from different perspectives. People have said different things about it, and I think there's validity. But at the same time, you sort of had to find some kind of like middle ground within that and see what exactly is this text saying.
Mhm.
And regardless, even if it's not always pretty, and maybe sometimes it's not really even intended on the part of the director, or it's kind of more unconscious. Um, Sometimes you can still like the text,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Like I like all sorts of things, and sometimes, dare I say it, some like kind of more like quote problematic art. Like I engage with it and I'm interested in it because of what it's saying about society, and sort of sometimes it's like from a detached sociological point of view.
Hmm.
That's how I approach like some films like from like D.W. Griffith and so on.
Hmm.
Um, does that kind of answer your question? I don't know. I kind of started going on a tangent there.
Answered a lot of questions. And I feel bad because you brought up so many great points there that I really want to touch on, and I know we'll get distracted by one of them, and I'll be editing
Oh,
this
that's
and be
totally
like,
fine. That's
oh,
totally fine. I'm cool with whatever.
yeah. Let's start at the first point in your response. In like the way you talk about the function of art as like a very fundamental like human thing. I think it's very telling of our difference in approaches when you talk about your first impulse is to talk about how it reflects culture and history. And I've noticed through watching your videos and listening to you, that's definitely your field of interest is evaluating films in a cultural context and like in a broader scope. Like you say in their in the Sallow Sardonicast response, you say every film is political. And in that sense, like I absolutely agree that every film can absolutely be engaged with in that context. But I also agree with the flip side, where it's that every film is the work of unindividual or individuals and are the preservation of personal insights from them. And that's the way I'm wired to engage with films as well. So I feel like both
Well,
our perspectives are totally valid and like
Well,
have that
I'm not
approach.
entirely sure that those are completely
Hmm.
contradicting each other. Because if you think about it, the personal insight that somebody provides, yes, they may not be completely. Well, in the case of Sallow, I think that Pasolini was very politically had a real political alignment in mind.
Hmm.
But a lot of times when it comes to a film, like somebody may just want to be expressing themselves, expressing their frustrations, responding to some kind of thing. I would still say it's political though in that sense, but because I feel like whatever means they're using to express themselves, and also like whatever they're trying to say with such means, ultimately they are in a roundabout way, maybe not completely in alignment with any kind of like party
Hmm.
or so on and so forth, but they are ultimately saying commenting on society in some way, I would say. So in that sense, I would still say it's political. I don't really know if we're really at odds with each other in this respect, actually.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I'm not saying we're at odds with each other. I'm just saying the method in which, like, if all I got out of films
Oh,
are what they say about society, that's not something that,
oh,
yeah.
you look at it kind of more from like an individual, from like the individual artist point of view, right? And try to see like what they're saying about society rather than what the text itself, divorced from the artist, is saying. Is that kind of what you're saying? I
No,
mean, I
no,
assume.
because I think the text can absolutely transcend the artist in a variety of cases. I'm saying
Uh,
I don't care what he has to say about a macroscopic, like, group of people or humanity or
mhm.
whatever. I only know what I can internalize to my own perspectives on things and my own, like, principles in a way. So what I'm saying is that this is something me and Zach kind of came to odds with in the last episode, where I talk about the notion of a universal truth, where I say that I don't engage with something like Shakespeare or Griffith, like looking back on this old antique. I engage with it the same way I would engage with a contemporary work, because in some of Griffith's works, well, actually, there's kind of a through line in all his works, but whatever. Like, there are things to be taken out about personal passions, about transcending yourself to articulate things that are constructive and important. And I engage with those things the same way I engage with things now. So that's why I say I don't engage with them politically, because I feel like politics has to do with the way society is structured and the culture is structured at the time. And I feel like to view things on an individual, like in a weird way, like universal perspective, is a way to look kind of away from those things and towards what I can do as a
Um,
person to be constructive.
I would still argue that it is political, actually, but I don't know. I see what you're saying. I think I see what you're saying at least. Basically, you try to kind of look at it from a more individualized, personal kind of perspective. And kind of the political like underpinnings of that is kind of more peripheral,
Hmm.
maybe sort of kind of like the umbrella to everything, but at the same time, you try to look at it more on that individual level. But you say
Hmm.
something about universal truths. I think that that's my question for you in response to that is like, how does a person, even if we are to assume there are universal truths, how does a person accurately measure that objective truth, that especially when it comes to like quality and art?
I
Um,
it feels weird to like because like I'm not really. To me, it's like if a film can articulate at least one piece of strong language or imagery or something that I can take away and internalize, then that's a good
so
thing.
it's
Like,
not.
yeah.
So it's more like how you can like engage with a text and then kind of extrapolate something from it that you personally recognize as an objective truth. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like, okay,
Okay.
that's when when I say
Because
universal, I don't mean applicable to everyone. When I say
yeah,
universal, I
maybe
mean
just say
not beholden
maybe you
to.
just say univer okay, maybe you just say like universal truth rather than objective.
Well, I
But I
never
think
said
like
objective. Or did I say objective? I might have
well,
said.
no, I think you just said universal, but I would say that there are more or less the same thing, regardless. Like or at least the logical trajectory of what universal truth is kind of would be an objective truth. But it's kind of like I think people are sort of wired, at least whether it be social, just like their natural way to sort out the world and recognize things as like objective absolutes and truths, and they try to like make sense of it. So that's why people try to like establish kind of like clear dichotomies, but in reality classifications of things, it's sort of somewhat arbitrarily paced, right? But I think like when it comes to like measuring like objective quality or universal quality, I just don't think that people are capable of doing it, even if a work technically has it. I think like the best argument one can make in that sense is actually if they adopt a theological framework, because that's like going outside the boundaries of like the observable like kind of like human world where people put their faith in something. But if it's not like a theological or kind of like metaphysical thing, I just don't see like really that much validity to something that's just kind of like, trust me, this is kind of like this humanist thing where like I just recognize this. It's like well, yeah, but like where does that really come from? Is kind of my question in
Yeah.
response to that. Because like I just don't, of course the postmodern idea there would be that there just are no like universal truths or that but like I don't know if I would necessarily go that far, because I think like but I just think that if there are universal truths we can't like accurately measure it, and you almost need to like first establish some kind of like framework in order to make sense of that. But then that framework is like the only way that for me to even recognize that is kind of like being like based off of like objective truths is it for it to be theological. But if God's not in the equation in this discussion, then I think like you almost can't really like adhere to anything like what you're basically describing is maybe not quite this, but like it's definitely adjacent to what in critical theory was called formalism, which basically came about like in response to kind of like the gradual decline away from like theological thought. But ultimately, formalism just kind of like is based the way that it worked for criticism is based on kind of like sort of like arbitrarily defined principles, but it's like why do we have faith in these principles? So then like all these critical theories, whether that be like modernism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, so on and so forth, all these different kind of like or even like Freudian analysis and like in adopting kind of like what somebody like Nietzsche or feminist theory, like these different theories that arose, those were all in response to formalism. What you're describing in a lot of ways, I feel like it was like implemented in society for so long, but then people are like, hey, this doesn't make any sense. So the way that I see it is either like you almost need that theological framework, or if you're wanting to move on from that, you can't really kind of like recognize things within like these absolutes. And I think like the postmodern response would basically be like, no, you have to like reject the notion of objective like truths, or at least when it comes to like objective quality. I don't believe for example like what's like well, I sort of maybe believe in objective truth. I just don't think that I can really like make a good case for them. I think that people tend to fall into these kind of mindsets. Um, but I think like at the end of the day, when I look at like two works of art, and if it's something like I don't know, like Tarkovsky's Stalker, and then I compare that to something like, I don't know, name like a new film, I saw this really bad film with Zach called Mitchell's versus the Machines. I really hated that
It's
film.
gonna keep calling out Mitchell's versus the Machines every
It's
episode.
it's terrible.
I disagree.
But
And we'll talk about that
right.
later. But
Yeah, we can get into that, but at any rate, like if I look at those two, I think like, yeah, there's an objective difference of quality, and yes, that's what I kind of like believe, like intuitively, but at the same time, can I really make that case, and should I make that case? And I think the answer is maybe not. Intuitively, I believe there's an objective difference, but of quality, but I don't think that it's really one can really make that case actually. So when it comes to high art and low art, I just don't really believe in that dichotomy.
yeah, no, I think you're zoomed way out. Like you're looking at like theology and all these classic ideologies and stuff, and really, I'm just talking about. Again, I didn't mean universal as in applicable to everyone. I meant universal as in not beholden to certain contexts or time periods. And so what I'm talking about is individual sensibility, because you brought up the framework. You need a framework to evaluate these things. And I'm feeling like that on a way that the way you choose to internalize insights preserved in a work of art is dependent on how you've developed your own principles through your own life experiences and your own influences. So in that way, that's what I'm talking about on an individual perspective.
Yes, but at the same time, like the individual perspective, we are kind of like beholden to kind of our social environments. We are kind of beholden to kind of our given time period and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
so when you talk
absolutely,
about like,
but
work
I'm
of art,
saying that like
when you talk
obsessing
about, you
over
know, talk about universal, when you talk about like universal or like kind of like what's recognized as universal, it's fine. We can just say universal truths. If you talk about universal truths, even that is sort of in some ways based on. It doesn't. It's
But
I
it's
think like the
cyclical.
logical
It's
trajectory.
cyclical.
It just.
What we're both
Well,
talking about, the individual experiences influence context that influence individual experiences. So we're really just
Yeah,
arguing
but
semantics here.
context also influences the individual, though.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's weird. I've never refuted the fact that you're right, but you keep pushing against my idea. I'm just saying that I internalize things on an individual perspective. In that, like, how will this affect my life in this like super small scale?
So let's just kind of look at it let's just look at it from kind of a more like personal, like individual level, right? Like a very personalized, where it's like, how do I feel? What you're saying is like what you prefer is when you watch something like Stalker or whatever movie you like.
Well, I think Sallow's a good example.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. If you look at, well, actually, Sallow is a good example because I feel like, so it's kind of weird because I feel like people on my channel have told me that like I'm either too cold and kind of like I'm either too cold, or they say that I am quite personal. It's interesting because I feel like the people that watch me, they will see that I sprinkle in a lot of kind of more personal stuff. If you watch my original Sallow video where I mispronounced the title, Salo, that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
But if you watch that video, that's quite personally driven because
Yeah, no,
like,
absolutely.
and I feel like some of my other stuff are too, but I'm trying to what I find most interesting, I guess, personally, is I try to look at where my personal response to something, but then I try to contextualize why do I have that personal response,
yeah.
and then that's kind of that's kind of more the wavelength where I write, because I try not to be too personal, but I let the personal kind of like seep into it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm just saying, like, I think the example with Sallow works so well is because I think it works from both perspectives. Like, to me, Sallow is one of my favorite films ever, not necessarily just because of its political context and what it says in that regard, although, of course, I acknowledge that's exceptional. But I think just the fact that it's such a pure, unfettered, like, that film, like, aesthetically, in the way it's so uncompromised, that is the result of Pasolini just digging deep and having a real sensitivity to his own perspective on these things, because that film looks, feels, and operates like no other film ever made that I can think of. And even if it did, it's still like such an uncompromised view on his point of view. So that's why, and I feel like the metaphors it has in it aren't these very complex ideological things. It's a very simple, it's really a study in control, which can be extended to any level, from individual to macroscopic and political. So I'm just saying like that's a great example of how
there's
we.
like a mass applicability to it, right? Is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And no, I completely agree. Even if I do believe that there is kind of like a specific intention that Pasolini was kind of fueled by, but I don't think like you need to, in terms of like analysis and approach, you don't have to necessarily like, prioritize that
Yeah.
per se. But ultimately, yeah, I do agree with you. And I think like when it comes to like I mean that's also one of my favorite films too. So we have some common ground here. But okay, but specifically with Sallow, I think like it is a very like kind of like my own engagement with it is a very personal thing because it speaks to the it really speaks to me in the sense of like what I perceive the foundation of good and evil in a way. And the way I see it, and what a lot of people don't seem to understand, even when they watch my whole video for whatever reason, is I think that there is an underlying kind of like level of beauty that's kind of that's between the lines that kind of that's like not necessarily even obscured. Some of it really is in plain sight, but it takes a couple of viewings to really see that, because that is basically what Pasolini is ultimately saying is that our desire to kind of like make sense of the world and kind of and spiritual journey as people is very much part of the human condition, naturally speaking, and he made that movie about Jesus as well. So because I think like ultimately like, but the thing is, what I think he was saying is like we need something to kind of like fulfill us spiritually, and without spiritual fulfillment, what really is left? And I think like you can kind of really look at that from a personal level. So what you're saying is like I feel like a lot of the ways that you're approaching film, I do approach film in this way. It just kind of more like the way I write about it is not necessarily completely in alignment with that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, in a way, like I think, for example, I mean, this example of a film you've championed and I kind of went against. I think our Funeral Parade of Roses reviews kind of show this kind of dichotomy where, like, I'm just focused on these very fundamental logical ideas of portrayal and stuff like that, and you're more focused on this wider cinematic context of like you had that Japanese film historian on where he went into how the film's documentary style was very influential at the time and about natures of these broader notions of like identity and queer content in cinema. But I was looking at it from how I think that film is a negative example of representation in perpetuating stereotypes and stuff like that.
But I think that may just be kind of a struggle that you have with sort of like, at least I would consider it postmodern art.
Yeah.
At least when it really becomes abstract, because I think like basically what the film is saying, it exists as this underground piece. It sort of is a political statement in some ways, but it's also really much about the individual identity, but also the individual identity in conjunction with the underground community where you find kind of solace within one another. But in that sense, like I don't think that the film would work as well if it were really bound to logic. Because at the end of the day, like when you're looking at like a film, like in a lot of ways, it still is a documentation of, well, at least if it's not animated, that's another discussion. Well, yeah,
Even still,
like,
with
argument there.
animation.
But when it comes to like a live action film, like you have it is a documentation of reality in some ways, but it's of performance. And then it's also like, but then if something's a documentary, it's still somewhat staged in the sense where it's like it's being preserved for the camera. And that's very unnatural. But what the film, what Funeral Parade of Roses is about, is kind of more about like, hey, this exists as a product of culture in response to culture, in response to kind of these social orders. And I think in a lot of ways, like in order to be truly free at like individual expression, you can't be like you can't so strictly adhere to this like overarching structure that normal people, by normal people, people that fall outside of your little underground community like adhere to and insist upon. Why not break it? Why not expose the artifice of
my argument with
reality?
that film is that it doesn't. I think it fits specifically within these sort of stereotypes. It doesn't provide anything that I
What do you mean by fitting
sympathetic.
within stereotypes?
Because in the sense that I think in providing this sort of detached, like the film's presentation, although I think it could be effective in certain respects, does not encourage sympathy and empathy and on the level relation to these characters. I feel like
I completely disagree with that one. Like I would say the exact opposite, but mainly what you're saying is that like it doesn't, because it doesn't take the characters seriously as characters in terms of like within its own narrative
But it's not
story.
about the
It's
narrative story. It's the fact that it, like I outlined in my review, the film has a variety of these very intense distancing effects that, like even a great deal is made about the documentary interviews that really say very little about these people, these like not even characters, people, individuals,
what it's saying
and
about
are
this,
really just
what
like
it's saying about this people is how they are in conjunction with the rest of the world. So in a lot of ways, this is kind of like in a good example of like what I was saying earlier, where basically these films, like this film, is about how the individual experience cannot really escape the overall confines of what defines them. But
and I
in order to
disagree.
express
Maybe that's why.
oneself,
Maybe I disagree.
why
Maybe
not?
that's why I don't like the film. And like,
Maybe, but
that's my main problem with postmodern art. I feel like postmodern art misses, like maybe a good like simplistic metaphor is misses the forest for the trees, in the sense that it's so obsessed with the machinations of communication. It's so obsessed with what's real, what's not, that it misses the notion that even approximation of reality is still an approximation of reality, and you can use these tools of communication to give people valuable insights into things. For example, I feel like a great example of that dichotomy in a singular artist's work is the difference between Bo Burnham's Eighth Grade and Bo Burnham's Inside. Bo Burnham's Eighth Grade, he doesn't worry about the artifice and about the notion of what's performance, what's not, and he just tells a real story that is applicable to a great deal of people. I would say applicable to everyone of this generation in terms of social media anxiety. Whereas with Inside, he gets so wrapped up in the machinations of what's performance, what's real, what's genuine, what's not, that I didn't gain anything from it. I just gleaned from it. I thought it was a very self-indulgent exercise in that way, and I usually don't like to use that as a thing, but I thought in that way it was more about him confronting his own insecurities rather than making something that's widely applicable beyond himself.
well, my question is why you need to actually make, if art is really kind of more for expression. Like my question then is why would Bo Burnham why would Bo Burnham really need to make something that's like completely outside of himself? Because I think ultimately like something like Inside is kind of a expression of himself. But I don't want to let you go so easily on what you're saying about Funeral Parade of Roses, because I think with that film, I completely disagree that's not saying anything about kind of like the more individual experience, because I think like ultimately like what the film is about is like it is about that individual experience. I think it is about kind of like that individual experience in conjunction with the community. You can't deny that. I don't think, but and also like you talk about how it's not wide applicable. It's not widely applicable to every single person on this earth. Yeah,
I
it
wasn't
isn't, and I
claiming
don't
that.
think
I
it should
never
be,
claimed that. I never
because
claimed
these
that.
are people that are ostracized by the regular person.
Yeah,
And
absolutely,
and
and it does
and,
nothing
in
to
that sense,
encourage
I would
a
say that the
base level
narrative
of empathy with
also.
these people as individuals. It still it uses a variety of, whether intentionally or not, it creates a huge distancing effect in the viewer that it feels the need to backpedal a great deal of its sequences, be it the experimental shorts that are very expressive and great, which it then has to assign to these this critique of cinephiles that is incredibly like finger pointy and unarticulated. And then there's obviously like the fourth wall break stuff, where you can't have a moment of great trauma for the central protagonist without a guy looking in the camera and saying, well, that was freaky. Those things do not help to push the film's central articulations forward. If anything, they put
No,
you backwards.
I completely disagree, because the film exists as an underground piece in opposition, or at least in somewhat encounter to the overall society at large. Because in order to make that point, you have to establish that dissonance.
I disagree. I think, like, would Sallow have worked better if there were fourth wall breaks and the variety of distancing effects used in Funeral Parade of Roses?
I think in that case, I don't. And now you're kind of getting me like creating fan fiction in my head, and I'm thinking like, would it be interesting if Salah were a bit more postmodern?
And
And
I disagree. I don't think it would be.
my answer to that is like I don't always like to think necessarily within what ifs, but it would just be a very different film if that's the case. But could it potentially work? Yes.
But
Do
I'm
I think it
making the
would necessarily
argument.
be better for the individual text? Maybe not, but I think in that case it'd just be a very different text. And when it comes to, but I don't think Sallow is really about the same exact things that. I mean, in some ways it is, but it's quite a different film from Prince of Roses. I
Yeah,
don't necessarily see them as like
I
all
agree,
that
but I'm
comparable in
just
that
using it.
respect.
I'm just using it as an easy example of a film which I think has a very important message about oppression, about people.
Okay, but the difference there is I think that like Sallow, if anything, you could argue is kind of more about the youth of today, or at least youth of
Well,
then.
sure, yeah, absolutely, and like in the individual
Right,
semantics.
but the difference there is like one's kind of more about like the broader generation, which is what Sallow is.
Yeah,
So it
exactly.
kind
But
of
like,
whereas Prince of Roses is specifically kind of more this underground
yeah,
queer community.
yeah.
It's very different. It's
Yeah,
different
I'm
types
not
of
arguing that.
oppression.
I'm not arguing that. And I didn't want to get involved in the semantics of each piece specifically. I'm just giving an example of a film that this is what I'm opposed to. This is what I mean by universal truths. Sallow is a film about people shown in the clearest way it can possibly be. Sure, it's performance. Sure, it's an approximation of reality. But it's using film as a method of communication. If someone's talking to you and they're just talking about the machinations of language and speech, that is absolutely valuable in certain contexts. But for postmodernism to imply that is the function of communication is absolutely misleading, because then you're missing the entire rest of human experience just because you're focusing on the machinations of communication, which is not productive.
Well, the thing is, I sort of understand like the idea that you kind of like saying here. I just don't necessarily agree that. Maybe I just don't think that you're really giving an accurate assessment of Funeral Parade of Roses in
Okay, sure, but
specific.
I don't care about the funeral parade of roses discourse. I
Yeah,
care about
okay.
the postmodernism discourse, because that's the more widely applicable concept here. Yeah, I
Okay.
agree. I would be open to reevaluating Funeral Parade of Roses. I was very upset that such a film was being championed for. Again, it was a similar thing to what I experienced in 2001. I go to the front page of Funeral Parade of Roses. No one's talking about really nuanced in a nuanced way. It's themes, it's articulations, it's this. They're talking about, wow, that was a crazy experience. Holy shit! And it's just like, well, maybe we should look deeper into this, because this is a nuanced text, and I'm just trying to analyze why it didn't work for me and why I didn't feel like I gleaned a great deal from it.
So yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. And by front page, I'm guessing you mean like Letterbox,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, okay, so one thing I'll say about this, Letterbox is basically just film Twitter,
Oh, sure.
and people just log onto Letterbox. They're just like, "Whoa, man! Like, I watched this movie, I don't really get it, but it spoke to me some way. I just don't know how to articulate that."
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And that's the case with 2001: Space Odyssey.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely,
A lot
and
of
I
times.
understand that. I was just using that as an example for how I felt alienated from the general response to this film, and hadn't seen a lot of dissenting views critiquing its methods of communication. But whatever. But I would love to have this conversation more later, because maybe once you read my review, I'm probably a lot more cogent than I am now. But I would like to kind of move on to something else you brought up earlier, which
Sure.
is the notion of medium specificity, about the notion of you can relate to film, and you can't relate to really music, and your friend can relate to paintings but
Well,
can't
no,
necessarily relate to
I
film.
can relate to
Oh,
music.
sure, yeah.
It's just more. I just engage with them differently
Yeah,
because sometimes I just don't. Sometimes I like to just treat something as a form of escapism.
yeah,
I don't necessarily want to know all that much more. Sometimes I
yeah.
just want to just like hear it, listen to it, and kind of like maybe I don't know like all the terminology, and I'm okay with that, right?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say that, like, the way you talk about engaging with films in different cultural periods and stuff, and engaging with those contexts, the
Yeah.
way I push against that, the notion of universal truth, is the same way I'd push against not engaging with music the same way as film as a rule. Even though I'm sure, like you do, I'm just using this as an example where
Right.
the same way I define film as the articulation of insight, think the same thing applies to music and paintings and speech and everything, where it's all just the preservation of these
Well,
individual insights, and that you can gain, in a sense, the same principles and experiences through these different mediums, and they're all just individual tools. That's what I'm proposing here.
okay. I'm sure I could find something that I disagree with that about, but at the core, I get what you're saying here. But my question response was when you say the articulation of insight, do you mean the articulation of insight in a way that the I guess with film the viewer will understand, at least on an intuitive level? Or do you mean just kind of like the articulation of insight for the sake of it being articulated, for the sake of expression? Because there's a difference between somebody expressing themselves and somebody telling somebody something. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. No,
Like,
and I totally agree. And I do think that is beholden to different context, where if you're
okay.
making a response to something, if you're in a dialogue, absolutely you do have to consider what you're doing for your audience, because that's the function of what you're working with.
Right.
But I would argue that when you're making a piece where you're articulating something individually forever, like where you're making a film, a novel, a piece of music, considering that audience can sometimes muddy your original intentions and make something that isn't as true to what insight you have. So I think in the sense, intention doesn't really come up when engaging with a work to me as much. Like, sure, that's absolutely helpful to engage with something, but at the end of the day, the work is the work, and you should engage with it as it exists, using whatever tools you can. But when it comes to
But
making
there's different ways to inform your opinion, basically, is what you're saying, right?
yeah,
But like,
or different elements
right.
that inform your opinion. Like, because like, if you hear the intent and then go back to the work and now see that thing is self-evident, that's absolutely valuable. But if you hear the intent, go back to the work, and the work disagrees with it, but you agree with the intent, well, then you don't like the work. You like the whatever was said about it. So that's the difference I'm saying. But yeah, my notion is that when you're considering the audience, that's beholden to context. But if you're preserving something forever and a personally formed insight, you should just make it as clear you can articulate and singular that thing is. Just like what Pasolini did with Salo, where it's so out of touch with everything else, it's just his singular vision.
I mean, I could probably still dispute that, but
Yeah.
but like,
well, no, and of course, like
yeah,
there's an interplay. I'm just saying, like that's the
right.
ultimate.
No. I know. I'm just saying I can be difficult like that.
That's okay.
No. I see what you're saying, but still, I think like. But do you think that maybe you may be thinking a bit too selfishly of that? I'm just throwing that out there. Do you think you may be thinking a bit too selfishly, or like too solipsistically, where it's like where to you all that matters is your own perceptions? Should you not maybe consider like what others are saying, and then maybe that can in turn inform the way that you look at the piece, and also the person who engages with said piece?
So, like, you mean when creating something?
Sure, but I was meaning actually just like watching like a film, and kind of like try you like I think it's good to try to maybe understand where people are coming from.
Yeah.
But what it
No,
seems
absolutely.
like to
Yeah.
me, what it seems like to me is that you have this framework, but I think there's flaws within that framework, and I think you don't completely adhere to it because I think you do want to know where other people are coming from and kind
But I
of like
never
what they're
implied that.
seeing, right, and then like what it means to them. But I think what you're kind of frustrated from what it looks like. We may be getting a little off topic here, but it seems like you may be a little frustrated by kind of like, for example, people on Letterboxd that you just want to know where they're coming from. You want to know how they're engaging with this piece, but it just seems like they're just sort of like copy pasting like what everybody else is saying, and what everybody else is saying is not actually that like really of depth. It's just like, whoa, this is crazy, man, right?
Yeah. Well, no, and I acknowledge that. I was using the front page of Letterboxd just as an easy example again.
Yeah.
Like, it's not. I don't put faith on the front page of Letterboxd being like, what?
Well, yeah.
They liked a bad
No,
film?
no,
Like,
no.
like, what are you gonna do?
That's fine, but I think based off of what you're saying here and kind of what you were saying in some of the other podcasts that you've done, I think you're kind of like you just want people to, like people have insight about like a given work or insight they've extrapolated from the given work. You want them to then articulate it to other people. You want to hear where people are coming from. You want to learn about art through other individuals' experiences,
Yeah.
rather than kind of more like an academic like analysis of said work. But you do acknowledge that those academic analyses can help inform like what the work is about and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, I would argue it's kind of all the same thing. If you
Yes.
have a sensitivity to something, it's the same thing of critiquing a work or creating a work. If you have a sensitivity to something,
Well, yes, because we all have our own like subjective differences and subjective like kind of interest. Where it's like, I mean, obviously, like somebody could like apply like a feminist like analysis of like let's say Stalker, or go back to
Hmm.
Stalker, where it's like, hey, like what's up with the way this film treats women? But then
Yeah.
you have somebody else that's applying a completely different framework. You know, it could be like a theological framework,
Yeah.
or a philosophical framework in some other respect, and you get different results because
Hmm.
people have different means of kind of like of preference in how they engage with the work.
Hmm.
But I think it's good to sort of have some kind of framework. But what I do with my videos is like, you know, sometimes when it comes to some films like Funeral Pretty Roses, I try to like just like spotlight the film, right? Because
Hmm.
I want more people to watch it, and I want them to kind of engage with it in different
Hmm.
ways and kind of talk about like what the context within the film. But also sometimes I want to sort of just like apply like my own interpretation. Like this is how I kind of view it,
Hmm.
and that can be backed up through this like sort of like critical theory. But you
Hmm.
know, when I apply like a critical theory to a film, unless like I'm writing it for school, you know, I try to be like lenient and loose. I don't try to be so strict with it, right? Because
Hmm.
there's different, and I do try to incorporate some tangents if I think like it will make like the video better,
Hmm.
or somebody may find it interesting. But the main thing is like when I make my videos, at least as of now, I've thought about doing a bit more experimental with some of my work in the future. But
Hmm.
what I'm trying to do right now is just kind of like is to articulate um different ways that they can engage with the film, whether you know, right? But so that's me communicating to them through, I guess, I mean, if you call video making art, you
Hmm.
could say so, I
Well, no,
guess.
it is. It's
um
communication. All art is communication to me.
you know, something that I do a lot of times, like I may like apply like auteur theory and kind of, you know, in some of my videos, but then pretty much every time I bring up auteur theory is like I think there's value to it, but I also like to demonstrate it's not the end all be all. It's just one way of looking at
Yeah,
it.
of course.
Like,
Well, and like because each film was beholden to the own circumstances of its creation, you know. So of course, like there is
right.
no one theory, you know. It's like saying like there's the theory for deciphering how people talk. There isn't because everyone talks differently and uses different things, and we expand that to film, you know.
I would agree to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, so yeah, man, you got deep. So let's keep going with. There's something I do want to confront here a lot.
Okay.
I do notice. I think you have. I think you've admitted this before too. A predisposition against children's films. 'Cause
Oh, I knew this was gonna be brought
yeah,
up.
yeah. Well, of
Okay.
course, with the
Uh,
Mission versus the Machines thing earlier, I gotta take
okay,
some vengeance.
so when it comes to Mitchell's, okay, I would admit I don't want to talk about Mitchell's versus the
Sure,
Machines
sure.
that much.
Yeah.
But when it comes to that film, so the way that I approach children's films,
Mm,
and sometimes I do watch them, sometimes kind of out of sheer curiosity, sometimes because I'm sort of interested in what is really being taught to children, sometimes
mm,
because I'm babysitting, which I haven't done in a while.
yeah.
But like for example, I watched like Angry Birds when I was babysitting, but I knew that the person I was babysitting had already seen it, so I wasn't like I wouldn't turn it off. But I'm watching it, I'm thinking like I don't think that this is really teaching that good of messages to children,
Mm,
and that's sort of what I see with a lot of children's films. Is I think that they. I know that I was just like shilling like Funeral Pretty Roses and stuff just a moment ago.
mm,
I'm cool with adult films, or not like porn films, but films that are made for adults to be vague and kind of be kind of like up for interpretation. When
mm,
it comes to films for kids,
mm,
I think they should instead be kind of a bit more clear cut and kind of aim for some kind of like messages or like a moral for the kids to understand. Yes, you can kind of deviate from like traditional narratives, but I think also like there is value to be found in kind of like adhering to that three act structure and to adhere to cliches, contrary to what frankly not that great of YouTubers say about children's films. I
mm,
think it's actually sort of good for them to have kind of cliche narratives
mm,
and to be predictable, because that children are kind of gaining a broader understanding of the world through these films, and and kind of like and they're building their sensibilities of story conventions. It's
mm,
cool to know. I'm cool. I'm all cool for conventions. I'm all cool for breaking conventions, but you first have to know the conventions in order to break them.
mm,
You have to have something there that's constructed in order to deconstruct it, right?
mm,
So kids films, I'm totally cool with them being like kind of more straightforward. But the thing is, what I see with a lot of these children's films that I've seen is I think that the messages that they're actually teaching children are not necessarily that good. or at the very least, they're deeply flawed. Angry Birds is definitely one of them.
I haven't seen Angry Birds, so I don't know, but
Yeah, Emoji Movie. I like, frankly, like the way that people responded to that movie was a bit like wild, but like it's not a good movie, I don't think, and not for because I don't think it's good for children.
okay.
Um,
So what about Mitchell
but
vs. the Machines? Do you think?
but okay, but when it comes to Mitchell versus the Machines, I think that okay. Well, I think it's a little okay. This wasn't really their problem, but like it was released at a very bad time, in my
See,
opinion.
I don't get that because Zach mentioned that last episode, but it's just a really simple, like, silly phone satire. Like, it's not
well,
like condemning the use of phones. It's just kind of like a jokey thing.
Yes, but at the same time, the thing I have an issue with that, beyond just finding it really obnoxious, to be quite frank,
and that's fine.
I
That's
just
fine if you
okay,
like were
okay,
personally
I find it
approached.
really obnoxious, but I also don't think it's necessarily that good for kids because I think that like its messages are very muddled. Okay, for example, it's almost like, oh yeah, we need to connect to each other. We need to connect better with each other, but we also need to recognize the place of technology and new forms of communication.
But I don't think that's the message of the movie.
No, I think right. It may not be the primary message, but it's there. But the issue that I have is the fact is in terms of the narrative is that like the villain is set up like as like this phone where it's almost like basically it's just framing technology as like kind of at least in some forms like this evil. She's set up as this character that should be a sympathetic villain where it's like you understand where she's coming from. She's the bandit, and that's kind of how we treat cell phones, where we get one and then we throw it out, right? And we get a new one. It's always the new.
But that's just a gag. That's just a gag in the movie. That's not.
No, it's just a gag, but it's still built. It's still part of the narrative. So
I don't think so. I think kids are not sensitive to that. I don't think kids will internalize that from the movie.
I think kids are smarter than you're giving them credit, though.
I think kids are smarter than you're giving them credit for.
No, I think they unconsciously do internalize this
No,
stuff.
I think that's such a throwaway bit.
When it comes to the this is my main point here. When it comes to the villain, she's set up as a kind of the sympathetic, like kind of like where it's like, oh, you get where she's coming from, even if it's ultimately just treated as a gag in the end. She gets waterboarded towards the end, and it's like, well, where is it? What's it really saying? I don't think it's really saying anything of depth.
That's not the core of the movie. That's a plot structure. The core of the movie is the central family's relationships. It's about the
Yes, and I think it's ultimately like framed. I think it's very much made by an older generation, like kind of like saying like, hey kids, we need to connect with each other. Yes, technology has a place within like this new environment. That's not the point of the
movie. You keep hammering on that. That's not the point. The point of the movie, I think the protagonist is an incredibly modern person, where she's a content creator. She's someone who's
yes, but
yeah, it's the same as eighth grade.
So in a lot of ways, it's acknowledging that there's new forms of communication through technology.
That's not what it's about. It has nothing to do with technology.
No, it is what you're saying. It's true. No, it's about human relationships within the family structure,
Sure.
and then also in our engagement or lack thereof with technology that emerges.
You're getting so hung up on the plot structure. It's the same thing Zach said last episode, where he says Soul is about the preconceptions of an afterlife. I don't think either of those films are about those things.
Okay. Well, first of all, like
no, okay. Again, let's not get hung up on the semantics.
Doesn't mean I agree with it.
Yeah, no,
Soul,
absolutely. I'm just
others.
using that as an example. I'm just saying that
Okay.
Mitchell vs. the Machines, I thought had a great insight about what being a creative person means in choosing your future, how to reconcile that with an older generation, about someone like obsessed with more traditional jobs and stuff. And I thought it had a really great message about how to communicate those things and how to.
And then by proxy, it's the means in which it uses to communicate that. I think there's also like there's byproducts of that kind of have very muddled messages, even if it's not necessarily the core thing we're supposed to focus on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can argue about the subtext of the movie, but is that worthy of a half star when you think a film has weird subtextual side things that you disagree with, which I think are not focused on in the movie at all? Like that's just a simple plot structure that, like you said, is to establish a common context with kids and make something easy to digest, which are the central messages, which are not objectionable.
Okay, so when it comes to giving star ratings,
I do know what I mean.
I don't value that at all.
Well, sure, but you still like you have a considerable audience. You've taken a strong stance against this movie on a public platform.
Yeah.
And I don't think
Well, part of that also, I think that adults like if a kid gets something out of it, that's cool. That's fine. There are movies that aren't for you that are more for kids,
Why is that? Why is that?
and
That's, I think, my central problem. I was thinking about this for a while,
okay.
because even with your Soul review, I left that fucking essay of a comment. It's
Wait,
that.
did you?
Yeah, I did.
What did I say about Soul?
You said kids movies should be made for kids, and I don't think that's your place to judge. You're not a kid, so why not? Why don't you
Well,
judge it? And
hold on. So if I were a kid, you think that so if I were a kid though, right?
okay,
It would be my place to judge whether a movie okay,
whether a movie was
what's the
made for
issue
kids,
exactly?
yeah.
What's the issue exactly?
I just think you should engage with the film out of what you got out of it, instead of engaging with this imaginary idea of like, well, what would kids think? That's not for you. What did you get out of the movie? You know?
Okay. But the thing is, what I get out of a movie like Soul, like I think like ultimately is not that much.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I think that's because you don't have a sensitivity to it, and that's fine. But you should acknowledge that and not act like this big arbiter of what kids will like.
No, what do you mean? No, wait. How do you interpret my review there?
I think you think kids wouldn't like the movie, and you are providing this voice
No,
of kids who wouldn't like the movie. Then what
no,
does
that's
kids
not what I'm
movies should be
saying.
made for kids
No.
mean?
What I'm saying is that I think that adults shouldn't be so hyper fixated on movies that are ultimately made for children.
Well, then again,
Yes, they can like them, but also the issue that I see with Soul, and you can maybe, and I think maybe the contention here may actually not be what in where you actually may think it is. But our disagreement probably actually lies more within like who I think that the film is actually marketed more towards. Because
Sure.
I would argue that over time, Pixar has sort of, yes, they still make films that are definitely for kids above anybody else, but they recognize that they have a growing audience of people who are a bit more older, who are a bit more, at least should be, a bit more mature, right? And I think ultimately a movie like Soul, I think like while it definitely has enough elements for kids to enjoy, and I think that's totally fine, that's totally valid.
Hmm.
But I think ultimately like it has also a lot of and we may disagree with this part. When I say a movie that's for kids should be made for kids, what I mean is it shouldn't be made for adults above kids. Um, and
But why?
because I think ultimately what adults will be would be getting out of it is a kind of the simplest answer for these like
But you
for
just
these
said these movies
problems
should
that the
have
kids
simple
shouldn't.
answers.
I don't think kids should be concerned with a lot of the stuff that Soul is talking
But
about.
I like in my comment, kids should, because there's a great deal of stuff in Soul about uncertainty, about choosing a career path in your future, or you're
Okay.
finding personal passions and stuff. That's all
Right.
directly relatable to kids.
Basically, so kind of like you would argue. So that's what I'm kind of thinking. Our disagreement here actually may be more about what the film's about, and
Sure.
my takeaway may be different from yours.
Yeah,
Do
absolutely.
I think there definitely is enough here that kids can enjoy. Don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
but what I'm kind of more focused on, what I'm kind of more like struck by is how is the more what I would consider more adult elements of it. And the adult elements are often kind of very kind of sanitized, but they ultimately aren't really something that I think that is the best for kids. Yes, there's stuff here that kids can get out of, especially from I can't remember the characters' names,
It's
but the
22,
girl
yeah.
soul. What's that? The female
22.
soul. What?
22, yeah.
22. Okay. So there's 22. I think that she's kind of the proxy for kids where they can she's the POV character, right? Where it's almost
Yeah, a
like
little,
the
yeah.
kid that's right. And she's trying to like find and she's like, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And that's okay. You know, she's constantly operating kind of like in like this like was it an afterlife or was kind of like a purgatory or
Yeah, like
so
a
you know what I'm
purgatory, yeah.
talking about, right?
Yeah.
Um or some kind of like waste, you know, something like in between, right?
Mm.
And I think for her, you could definitely make the argument, and I would actually agree with you that that character has enough to her that she is very much like it's very appropriate for kids in that respect.
Yeah.
But I think like a lot of kind of the more existential dread is stuff that I personally don't necessarily think young children should be as Well, it's okay to have some. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a good, in my opinion, at least what I got out of it personally, is that I thought, oh wow, this is a bit too adult for children. But then it's like, but is that okay? Because is there enough there for kids? And maybe there is enough there for kids. But then like, well, what? How do I treat the more adult stuff? Well, as a young adult myself, I look at this more adult stuff, and I think, well, this is just not really yeah, I know that, and this is what I'm seeing with a lot of people. A lot of adults liked it for the adult stuff. A lot of people were praising it, like, oh, this is more adult. I can't believe they made a film for adults, and it's like,
But
I don't think that's a good thing. But that's what a lot of people were saying, right? And my response to them is, hey, maybe instead of watching this, you should be watching films that are actually more for adults that aren't giving the simplest answers for these more complex situations.
I would argue
But
Soul doesn't give simple answers. Soul is a very open-ended movie while also encouraging introspection. In
Okay,
fact,
so-
like my biggest argument is that
Okay.
I got way more out of Soul than an adult movie like Hereditary.
Oh, well, okay. I think to me, okay, I think I may like Soul more than her. Well, I don't know. Hereditary has its moments, but
Yeah, but
that's
typically
a weird
Hereditary isn't a
comparison.
film
That's
about.
a weird comparison,
No,
man.
I think it's actually a very important comparison because Hereditary is a
Okay.
film that works entirely off preconception. The reason it's considered, I've seen that film on Best of the Decade list. When we know, we've seen Ari Aster's background. He's a dipshit. He doesn't know anything about people relations. He has no insights.
Have you seen? Okay, a little bit of a side tangent. Have
Yeah.
you seen the strange thing about the Johnsons?
Yes. What
It's
the
terrible.
fuck? How did
One
he
of the
get a
worst things I've
multi-million
seen.
dollar movie deal off of that? But the thing is that film operates the same way as Strange Thing About the Johnsons. But but Hereditary has this enticing cinematography, these weird kind of symbolic elements with the dollhouse and stuff. But in reality, it's just a stupid horror film. It's just and that's cool. If it was engaged as a stupid horror film, I wouldn't feel the need to rail against it. But
There
people
are
think,
I'm not really in the mood to defend Ari Aster because
Sure.
I'm kind of like split on him. But like there are things I liked about the movie, but there are also a lot of things I didn't like. But
Sure.
but in relation to kind of like where Soul fits into this, I think like a person definitely can make a case for Soul. Don't get me wrong. The things I post on Letterboxd and Twitter, it's hyperbolic. The stuff I put in the stuff I talk on Zach's channel may be hyperbolic too sometimes.
Yeah.
But the stuff I put on my own channel, for the most part, I would say that that's a bit more kind of like where my, I could, if I wanted to, I could probably make like a analysis of Soul. I think I think I could make an analysis of any film really.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I'm more driven by the things that I'm more interested in,
Sure.
right?
Yeah,
And I'm not
and that's
particularly interested in that. But the thing is, what you're saying, my little my little comment on Letterboxd is a response to the way that I'm seeing a lot of people engage with the text, right? Maybe that's not how you see it, and maybe you're getting something out of it that you personally view as profound. That's cool. I'm fine with that. It's whatever. But ultimately, I think that the way that people were championing this film is it kind of sets a bad precedent, because I think that Disney and Pixar needs to stop having such a hold on the American culture.
Well, yeah.
And probably not just American culture, probably just kind of the Western culture.
Yeah,
and especially for adults, and because they're like, whoa, this is like, look at this film. Like, listen, like all that existential stuff I think it's been done better in other films. Personally, can you get something out of it? Sure, I bet you can. That's fine. But at the same time, like the film, it's ultimately made for kids. It shouldn't like. I don't think it's as much made for adults.
Those
Okay.
arguments? Why not reserve those arguments for like Marvel films? Like Marvel films are films that are so much more simplistic, have way less things that you can constructively gain
Okay,
from
so
them, and are talked about way wider.
You'd argue a Marvel film is a lot more simplistic than Soul, and you're thinking that I'm just not giving Soul enough credit, because
way,
I
yeah.
actually have. Okay, I have analyzed a couple children's films on my channel actually. I think The Land Before Time, for example, the original Land Before Time is a great movie. And may I like kind of elaborate on why I think that is? I think like adults can appreciate it, and probably should appreciate it. For the way that it communicates messages to both children and adults, because if you look at like one scene, like within it, basically kind of the children dinosaurs notice kind of like these they're sort of like unaware, or they're not exactly unaware, but they're raised in an environment that's basically like apocalyptic, right? Where life is the age of the dinosaur is kind of fading.
Yeah.
And there's this moment where they see like these sauropod dinosaurs, kind of like brontosaurus, brachiosaurus kind of thing. But I think it's like a seismosaurus, but that's a whole other thing. Basically, there's a lot of like long necks, as they call them. We're eating like all these leaves, and the kids are watching, and they're like, "Hey, they're eating all their food. They're not even sharing." So to the children, that implicitly sends a message of, "Hey, we need to share with each other." But to the adults, there's a dual message in it. To the adults is that, wow, these children are looking at things very kind of naively, very like innocently, and not in a condescending way, but it's like, oh wow, that's kind of like heartbreaking, because the adults know it's like survival of the fittest,
Yeah.
right? And it's very different messages for different audiences together at the same time. And I think in that way it works very well. Something like Soul, maybe I'm not giving Soul enough credit. Maybe there's something that I wasn't really kind of like appreciating about it, and maybe I have too many like biased like predispositions towards Disney and Pixar films based on the previous track record.
Yeah.
That I just was not engaging with the text as sufficiently as maybe I should have.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the way that people engage with Soul is what I was more so critiquing within that kind of little blurb. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you know what? I can understand that, but the thing that like I kind of thought was a contradiction was for just an example that you rated very low, is Spy Kids 3D. Like, that's a film that is made for kids. I rewatched obsessively.
Okay,
as a kid.
I have no comment about that film. It's been way too long.
Oh,
Like,
sure.
I just
Yeah,
have
it's fine.
nothing
I
to
just
say
feel
about
like
that. Okay, a lot of my ratings were imported from IMDb, and I rated
Yeah.
and I started that IMDb when I was 16, so I have nothing. Like,
Yeah.
like
Well, no, and that's just a tendency that I've kind of noticed that kind of upsets me, is that you'll notice way lower averages. Again, this is me freaking out against the masses. It's just something that like I've noticed, is that you'll notice an average children film for someone growing up in the 2000s will have a way lower average than any other movie, just on like as a tendency. And that's because people get this notion that, oh, this is a children's film, I can't like this because I'm a grown-up. So then they'll half-star Spy Kids movie and five-star Hereditary.
I think that's a very immature mentality, but at the same time, I would still argue that we should sort of move away from social infantilization, which I kind of feel like with the proliferation of both of the Marvel movies and with the proliferation of Pixar and Disney, even if they have some good films. I even think that Pixar has some good films, by the way.
Yeah.
I quite like Toy Story, and I think Monsters Inc. is pretty good too.
Yeah.
But ultimately they I think that like the proliferation of it's consuming culture too much.
Yeah.
And to the point where movies that are made specifically for adult audiences are sort of getting dumber. Or at least it seemed like that.
Yeah,
at least
for
in the
sure.
Hollywood
And
system.
I would rather critique those movies because, in a way, kids' movies are getting
Right,
better.
but I think but the thing is, I think that's kind of looking at it a bit too much on an individual level, because I think it sort of kind of says something about society at large, where it's like, hey, I think it's a mixture of both, where society itself is becoming a bit more infantilized, and partially it's because we've become a bit more with the proliferation of the internet and kind of like the way social media has gone. The way that that Western culture has gone is kind of like we recognize kind of like there's so many like social injustices, and it becomes more and more like kind of like apparent, and we kind of want this form of escapism. And I think like it's cool to have escapism. I do think so. And on an individual level, I don't really judge, but at the same time, I think it says something about society where like I think like Hollywood movies, they're not only becoming more corporatized, but they're also, and that's an issue. And I think but they're also becoming the sort of infantilizing culture.
Yeah.
And I think that social infantilization is intrinsically tied to this like heavy commercial cinema, and I think it's not really doing society any favor.
Yeah, absolutely.
But,
and if you want to like rail against that tendency, absolutely. But is it Soul's fault? Like, I mean, like in the same way you can engage with it.
Probably not specifically, no.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
that's the thing. Like, you're engaging with its marketing, its response, but like in the same way, you can still engage with a Lenny Riefenstahl film or a D.W. Griffith film. You should still be able to engage with Soul on an individual basis and what it's articulating. And what I think it's articulating.
Yes, absolutely. But when it comes to Soul specifically, I would just say that personally speaking, I was not particularly impressed.
Sure.
Maybe it was just the given time that I was watching it.
Yeah, but I would love for you to delve into that.
I was not particularly impressed, and I think that ultimately kind of the messages that it was sending, maybe there's some things to salvage that were good, but at the end of the day, I think that it was not how I personally would have liked it to be,
Sure.
and even if I just don't think I just didn't really think much of it, like positively.
Yeah.
And the discourse around it was even worse.
Yeah,
But I try
absolutely.
not to let discourses around films really like kind of affect my opinion too much.
Sure.
But sometimes when it comes to children's media, it's kind of I will admit maybe there are some biases that I do have towards it, but I try not to. But at the same time, I feel like I'm more forgiving of things that are older.
Yeah.
It just is true.
No, that's fine.
When it comes to things because the society itself has kind of like maybe it's not really Soul's fault, but Soul exists as like one example of quite a few of a time period where I think that things are very. I feel like things are really kind of like out of order.
Yeah, no, it's dangerous.
That's like kind of like infantilized society, and I don't think that it's like maybe it's not Soul's fault specifically, but it's ultimately kind of contributing to something that's an issue right now. Like for example, and I'm sure that okay, I'm under the opinion of like that kind of like I look at things through paradoxes, right? Like and I found that to kind of be a healthy way of approaching art because I know for sure that there definitely are some hypocrisies in the way that I approach art. You know, for example, I may like something from like T.W. Griffith that has very strongly strong like a political like kind of like implications that are in complete opposition to my own.
Yeah.
Whereas something that whereas something that's a bit like a bit more approachable and more agreeable, I may dislike for political reasons. So I understand there's an incongruity, and I do like kind of appreciate things kind of from a detached sociological lens sometimes, at least, especially when it's like a work of art that could potentially be seen as dangerous or like or deeply like kind of harmful.
Yeah.
Right. Like okay, but for example, like I've defended Zack Snyder on my channel before, and I plan to continue doing so.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like he ultimately does make films that I think are in, if not directly, indirectly contributing to kind of this mass like infantilization and intrinsic like kind of link to commercial like consumerist nerd culture that I think is damaging.
Yeah,
it's true, and it's like, is it his fault? No. But then the question then is that I would say that I would have for myself would be like, should I really be like so like harsh towards something like Soul? The thing about Soul, I just didn't like care for it. That's just the end of the day.
Yeah, it's fine. I just don't want you to be articulating yourself for disliking this film for the wrong reasons. But I think what
but my question then is it really the wrong reasons though in this case? But at the end of the day, I think like
it's like half starring Evangelion because you hate anime conventions. It's like
I love End of Evangelion.
Yeah, right. It's a great film, and that's why I chose it because I know you liked it. It's because it's like, is Evangelion
I think that's one of the hey listen End of Evangelion is one of the best films ever made, hands down. If it's not the best animated films, I'm drawing a blank on what the other one I think is the best. So,
no, absolutely, no, it's phenomenal. I mean, I'm obsessed with Evangelion. But that's the thing is that like I feel like the way you critique Soul is the same way as like blaming Evangelion for the rise of like waifu culture and loneliness. When it's like, sure, I mean Rei and Asuka are kind of icons of that sort of movement, but that's not.
Oh, okay. So I guess the thing is that the problem here was what you're saying is like anime is kind of like one of those things where like one of the reasons I don't watch it that much is sort of because of the culture that surrounds it that I find quite like obnoxious.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, but I still like some anime films. It doesn't really prevent me from watching. I just watch them less than other things that, even though I'm sure there are plenty of things that I would still like.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it is true that like. I don't necessarily. I can divorce a text from its overall context. It's true.
Exactly.
Or at the very least, not necessarily divorce it from that context, but kind of like don't focus on that so much. And I would prefer looking at the individual text too. So, but sometimes when I talk about writing, there's just different ways I want to write sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes when it comes to like some children's films, I may just want to talk more about the culture at large and use that as an example.
Yeah. No, yeah, for sure. And I understand
maybe there are some biases that I have towards like children's films, at least of the contemporary age, because I see so many patterns that I think are harmful. But I also do think that it is somewhat healthy to be critical more so of children's films than other things. And the reason why is because I would argue that children's films are some of the most potentially dangerous films made.
Absolutely.
And the reason why And the reason why is because this is what we're ultimately kind of raising children on.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, that's why something like, for example, the Emoji Movie, or even to choose a really stupid example, Food Fight. These are films that.
Oh, I hate. Yeah, Food Fight's terrible.
Yeah, but you see, it's funny because Food Fight is a movie everyone hates, and they should, because that is a film that is solely about product, consumerism. It's like brainwashing for children. It's a really bad idea, and absolutely that's why. But I feel like people feel very similarly. I think people have a, like, parents have an innate sense of protection over their children, and that's why they really want to, like, vet the content. And that's why I'm kind of glad Pixar, although they're connected with Disney, all these awful cultural practices, has continued to make films with good messages, because they know they can't sell them without that. And that's why something like Marvel slips through the cracks, because people aren't as watchful over those films. So I'm just
Well,
saying,
actually, but the thing is, I would still maybe kind of like bring into. I mean, I haven't really caught up with Pixar that much, but like, um, I would still argue that a lot of these children's films that supposedly teach good messages, like even if the core message that's identifiable may be good, there's still a lot of other implications by the way that they convey it that I think are not good. Like for children. Do I think that Pixar can make some good films? Yes,
yeah,
I do, or at least they have.
yeah. I just think like hating something on principle, like half starring Soul
I don't.
because it's a Pixar movie.
Oh,
And
oh,
no, I'm not
I-
accusing you of this. I'm just saying this is a tendency people have. It's like, you can't blame the work for these greater contexts, but you can critique the context and see how we can get above that. And I think those are kind of separate conversations where, like, in 200 years, people can go look back on Soul and be like, oh, this is a cool movie. It has these cool things I can internalize that are divorced from whatever negative tendencies you might
Right,
see.
and I think right, and especially yeah, I can see that, and also like I think that you can definitely look at different texts that are that are simple or complex,
Yeah.
and sort of find some kind of like value within them. That's what I do a lot of the times.
Yeah,
You know,
And I know you do that, and that's why
I'm
I
just
was like, what's with this then?
well, yeah, I could see like an issue there. I use ratings on like Letterboxd because I don't take that site seriously.
Yeah. Well, I didn't mean to
but
harp
like
on those so much.
I don't use that. I don't use like kind of like I try to avoid like kind of like qualitative like judgment.
Well, yeah, yeah.
In my videos actually. So like sometimes people won't even know if I like something or not because I'm just trying to like, kind of like look at sort of neutrally. But
And that's a
sometimes I
great
do
approach.
kind of like people can usually tell that a lot of times that I do like something or
Yeah.
I don't, but I try to like I may say something that I like it or I think this is good or so on and so forth because I think it's still important for conversation to some extent. From the more personal level, but at the same time, like when I'm analyzing a work, I'm sort of like divorcing my own like emotions about it.
Yeah.
It does depend though, but I try not to. I want people to think for themselves though. I
Well,
want
yeah.
people to think outside of kind of like what they're told to think.
Well, I think
And
that's the
another thing.
most. I think that's a really important process of having that initial response, accepting it, analyzing it, and then determining how you can spin this into something that is applicable to others. And I think that's important for art
Yes.
creation and art engagement.
Yes, because the way I see it, and this is what I find so like nihilistic about so many like YouTubers, they'll get like 100,000 like even if they had just have like 1,000 subscribers, if they have like 100,000, it's even worse. If somebody like Leafy is here, it's even worse because I think like why would you have so many subscribers and you don't want to improve their lives?
Yeah.
Challenge them in any way.
Yeah.
That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
Like how? You know,
Well, and you get even worse. Like, I think that's the worst kind of thing on the flip side beside art engagement is art creators, where they become so obsessed with the notion of having a career that they stop evolving their art, stop preserving things that are widely applicable, and instead just kind of chase these ideas of weird things. Like, to me, like,
yes, but at the same time, I think it is important to kind of like see the cultural canon and sort of kind of engage with what people around you are sort of engaging with.
Sure.
And that's kind of why I started shifting a bit more to a bit more popular films because I have that back catalog of things that people haven't seen or don't care about.
Yeah.
And then but I'm starting to do a bit more things like I did Sounds of the Lambs, I did Blade Runner, I did Boys Don't Cry, and some movies that people actually know.
Yeah.
And it's like they want to hear my thoughts, and that's cool. But it's like, or Star Wars as well.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like I think it's important to have both, though, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
To
And
kind of like
The thing is, when you review those films, it's not at the price of genuity. Like, it's not like you're like, ah, well, I guess I'll just do this because it's popular. It's like, no, you're just shifting your focus and sensitivities to something that's applicable to other people, which is what we were just talking about. You're trying to communicate something to make people's lives better, and you know they'll engage easier with this, that's different.
Yeah, and what I do, and because I also I teach English composition at the moment. Well, not during the summer, but like
Yeah.
that's my job currently.
Yeah.
So I teach in a university, and a big part of what I'm doing is I try to get people to think more critically.
Yeah.
And that's what I do with my videos too. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's like that's a fantastic goal. Yes, I don't really know where to go from that. Can I bring up another? Just again, you've talked about how your letterbox that means nothing over and over again. There's just one film I'm so passionate about that you kind of had an offhanded review about. I just kind of want to dig deeper.
Is that what I think it is? Go on.
I don't know. Midori, the
Oh
Russian,
no. Okay.
Oh, what did you
say
think it
good
was?
time. I thought you were gonna say
Oh
good
no,
time.
that's on the list. Don't worry, you're not getting off the show on that.
Okay. So Midori. Remind me, is that the one where they crush puppies?
Well, that's one scene that everyone reduces the movie to, but yes, it does have the puppy stepping
okay,
scene.
so the way I look at that film, okay, so I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I gave that 2.5 out of 5.
Yeah, like
on
not a
Letterboxd.
negative review at all. I'm just surprised though someone, because you have this great passion for Salo and all these misunderstood films, that something like Midori, which is a film misunderstood by a lot of people, just had this very toss off take.
To me, I get a little I feel a little weird when it comes to like children, honestly. When it comes to, like Sallow, they're at least like teenagers. Like when it comes to like children, it's a bit sort of like difficult for me to stomach.
Sure.
And that's sort of like kind of my personal reaction. But also, it's like it's almost so gross, and the way that it uses animation is very gross. It's quite like fascinating in some ways, but it's like I just don't know how I feel about it, honestly, and that's kind of why I gave it kind of like just in the middle, kind of like of a rating, because I don't really know how I feel about it. I'm sure if I tried to kind of like look into it and write about it, I'm sure I'll probably like it more. When I write about films, generally speaking, I like them more. It just happens. I did that video on Leon, and even that one, it's like, I quite criticize it, but I'm a little confused if I like it or not.
No, yeah,
because
that's a prickly movie. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because there's things to talk about, but when it comes to Midori, I definitely think there's a lot there to kind of like appreciate, and I understand why people like it. I don't really have that much to say about that one at the moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I understand. Like, I just wanted to clarify that, and I just say, that film is very worth checking out because that was animated by one guy over like a decade.
Yes. Okay. So like, in theory, I should be praising it. I feel like.
No, and who
knows?
I'm glad
Maybe
you're not
sometime down the
disingenuous.
road I'll talk about it on my channel. Who knows?
Yeah. No. Yeah. It's no problem. I'm just saying that's like one of my like 10 favorite movies for sure.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
That film is. I mean, but then again, I like it for a lot of the similar reasons I like Sallow, where it's just this guy made something out of time, out of context, and just made something so singular, so passionate, and so beautiful. Like, yeah.
So you quite like passion projects, and I'm not gonna lie, I quite like them too. Like sometimes you can just tell if something's a passion project.
Well, if someone's gonna say they don't like passion projects, they're probably a fucking psychopath. So
Well, yeah.
But
or a Marvel fan.
You never know. But actually, you know what? Maybe that's not as absurd as an argument as we're making, because I think a lot of the films we talk about, Sallow, Midori, or of course the kind of a big film when talking about this stuff, The Brown Bunny, those get accused of self-indulgence, where it's like, oh, this guy was so passionate, he lost the narrative and stuff, and which is so weird because people would say those exact same things about a film they like and say, oh, this guy was so passionate and honed in, he made something so different and changed the game. But it's just ridiculous, that kind of criticism. I'm just saying that might be something people say to those sort of films.
I agree.
Yeah. So sorry, that was a rant. That wasn't a.
But it's just kind of like some arguments I just don't really. Okay, here's the thing. When it comes to a lot of like arguments, I try to entertain them. I really do.
Yeah.
But sometimes it comes a point where I just think like I just don't. Just like sometimes it's just like I just don't think it's worth engaging with.
Yeah, but because
like, so it comes to some like I just put out a video like at the time of this recording, I did this today, on Gaspar Noé and whether or not like the accusations of homophobia actually like are of merit, and because I think it's at least worth discussing. Just like when I did the Phantom Menace, I talked about kind of the racial implications of it, like because I think it's worth
Yeah.
discussing. It's a conversation was worth discussing because there's some arguments that I just don't think are worth like my time.
Yeah.
A lot of like pure, very ultra puritanical takes about like how like sex scenes shouldn't be in movies. Like I see that on Twitter sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm like, just get that away from me. I don't need to know that that's even a conversation
Yeah.
at the moment. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, yeah.
so like, and sometimes like there's some interpretations that I think are like, I don't think it's necessarily the artist's responsibility to pander to make sure that idiot audience members understand their work.
Yeah.
Honestly, with maybe some reservations for some children's films for for obvious reasons. But I guess like I forget where I don't know where I'm going with this
No, yeah,
actually.
that's fine. But I totally understand where you're coming from, and it's just about choosing your battles. You know, it's like if you find someone who's being an idiot, but you see where they're coming from, you see
Yes.
some of those kind of reservations in yourself.
Well,
That's a conversation. But if you see someone
yeah,
who's
yeah,
just ridiculous, like what are you gonna do?
Yeah, and that's the thing because I think like it's worth having these discussions, right?
Yeah.
Because like 'cause people are having these discussions, and it's like, hey, would this affect? Should we consider this more because we can deepen our appreciation for the film, or sometimes it may not be in its favor. It happens, but we are still engaging with it more. That's how my take.
Well, and speaking
But
of arguments, let's talk about the Safdie brothers. If you're ready for that.
okay, okay, tell me this first off. What's your main issue with Ari Aster? Because I'm gonna relate this to the Safdies.
Yeah, no, I'd be excited to hear it. My main issue with Ari Aster is I don't feel like his films come from a place of sensitivity. His films come from a place of assuming what is to be taken seriously, taking these sort of like he's admitted he's a very kind of collage-y guy. He takes things from films he likes that he finds thrilling and wants to make these ultimate roller coaster rides that also pander to preconception, because that way you don't have reservations about this crazy thing, you at least for artier people, which I'd assume he is, and are willing to commit to something like Hereditary because it has these big arty notions and can then have a dumb roller coaster ride. That's what I think of Ari Aster.
So would you say that also he may have like a problem of kind of like putting too much on the screen at once where it's like oh I need to constantly shock them, I need to like put this, think about like the decapitation scene and then the aftermath of that,
But
for
then again,
example.
I feel like that scene's underdone. If anything, I think the editing of that scene is just
Oh, okay.
really janky and just weird and arrhythmic. I don't
So,
know.
so I would like to, and I will get to the Safdies here in a moment
Yeah.
here, but so the issue that I have with Hereditary, the decapitation, it's not so much the decapitation in itself,
Yeah.
or that scene. I actually like that scene from memory at least I was kind of like hooked, but
Sure.
so I posted this elsewhere before, but so like the rotting head shot in Hereditary, when you see it on the road. The issue I take with this moment, it isn't like showing such a horrific sight because like
Well, like Sallow,
I'm
I
all
mean.
for like having these visceral sequences and seeing like these like shocking things on screen.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the horror of the situation was already established from the son's point of view. Was it Alex Wolf?
Yeah.
So the horror is basically what he does not see because it's the peripheral. He's
Yeah.
like he looks behind and he knows that like, oh, this is my sister and her head is off. And it's like so it's like you feel for him,
Yeah.
right? And then like he goes to bed, he wakes up in the morning, he hears screaming from his parents.
Yeah.
And I
It
would
kills that
maybe
payoff.
be yeah, I would maybe be forgiving if it showed the parents' reaction to seeing the decapitated body.
Yeah.
But then it cuts to, but we don't see that, and I'm cool with not showing that also because it's more about the son in that moment, and that's where the horror is coming from. Like the reactions, like what am I going to be put through now? What does this mean to me? What does this mean to my family?
Yeah.
But it's a very personal level. But it doesn't even show what the parents are seeing. Instead,
Exactly.
it's showing what the police are seeing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
With the decapitated. And what that's ultimately saying is that's just to shock the audience.
Yep.
And I just don't see much value in that. And because I feel like it's sort of like obscuring like what it's actually doing. Because I think it's just like Ari Aster, watching The Strange Thing About the Johnsons really contextualized how kind of like misguided of a filmmaker I think Ari Aster is. Don't get me wrong, I think Aster is talented behind the camera, but he doesn't know how to sort good ideas from bad. It's a similar issue that I have with Aronofsky.
Sure.
It's not exactly what like the site of this head represents in relation to the source of horror. It's like it doesn't really say anything about the characters in the moment. It doesn't say anything about the way that the horror is established. It's all over the place.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And that's exactly what I was
but
talking
the rest
about.
but the rest of the film does little to present this like unbiased, like objective, like God's eye view of the events. So brief asides just feel like so unearned, edgy, and inconsistent.
Yeah.
That's my take.
Well, and that's exactly what I was talking about. That comes from, like, if he was making a film of someone who had experienced familial trauma or had insight into this familial trauma, that weird, insecure, contradictory presentation wouldn't be there because he would know not to do that. But that's not his goal. His goal is to approximate these things for the goal of a roller coaster.
Right, and a lot of people call this kind of like elevated horror or something. I don't know where that's coming from. I wasn't that big on The Lighthouse either by Robert Eggers, but I actually did like The Witch. But at any rate, the those like criticisms that I have towards Ari Aster, what I was just saying about that head scene.
Yeah.
I have similar issues with I've only seen I've seen some of their shorts which I have mixed opinions on.
Yeah.
But the Safdie brothers, the main two films that everybody talks about, Good Time and Uncut Gems.
Yeah.
So think about like similar to Hereditary is in Uncut Gems, like there's sequences of like Adam Sandler like doing like crazy things, right? And sometimes it's fun, don't get me wrong. I think I would probably like Uncut Gems a bit more if I rewatched it. But there's like but I feel like it doesn't leave any room to breathe. And it's almost kind of like very yes, it builds anxiety and I get that. It would actually be more anxiety inducing if it has some kind of more of a proper counterbalance.
Sure.
Some may argue it does, and I think Uncut Gems does this better than Good Time. But I would say like it's almost relentless, and it doesn't like it's like something always has to happen because like I feel like the Safdie brothers are worried about like I don't want people to be bored at any point. I want them to always have like, but it's like it's just so to me that actually is boring because it's like constantly it's like Adam Sandler doesn't just have to get into an argument with his mistress. He has to like splash like a milkshake in her face or whatever.
Yeah.
It's constant. It's the same thing same issue they have with Midsummer and Hereditary. I like Midsummer a bit more, but like it's like this constant thing. And in a lot of ways, we talk about like elevated horror. The way that I see like the way they look at the way that a lot of kind of like dare I say normies look at like Good Time and Uncut Gems. They look at it from a very kind of like superficial way where,
like an elevated
they don't
thriller.
say it, they don't call it this, but they look at it like as elevated thriller.
Absolutely,
they look at it as like elevated Robert Pattinson picture, elevated Adam Sandler picture.
Yeah.
And it's like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's different ways to look at these films, and I express myself hyperbolically on Letterboxd when it comes to these films. But ultimately, like I just like the same. I have very similar issues with Aster as I do the Safdie brothers.
Yeah.
At least based off of these two films.
Yeah.
Some of their other stuff looks kind of good. There's something about like Pleasure of Being Robbed, or I don't remember what it's called.
That's an amazing film. Yeah, Pleasure of Being Robbed. Yeah,
that actually looks quite good to me.
It's really good. Yeah, and that's weird. People like pass that one over. That's like my second favorite of theirs. But anyway, sorry.
Well, that's why I think it's probably good.
Yeah,
because people don't like hail it.
No.
Like, well, I mean, I don't know. I'm being a little contrarian in that sense.
No, yeah.
But at the end of the day, like I feel like the Safdies are a bit too insecure with like letting the film breathe for like 2 minutes. And they just throw so much stuff on the screen. Some of it does aid in kind of the overall thematics, don't get me wrong. They are telling stories. There's value in Good Time, there's value in Uncut Gems, don't get me wrong. But when it comes to like Uncut Gems, also it's like, you talk like I find like I try to avoid using the like terms like emotionally and manipulative, because I feel like, well, doesn't a good film manipulate the audience?
Exactly, yeah.
Like, so, but I don't know, but I don't know how else to really put it, at least kind of off the cuff. the ending where it's like you cut to like people with like a bunch of neurodivergent people,
Mhm.
and it's like and it's suddenly like cue the sad music after all like this epic like whoa somebody falls off a building and like and somebody sees it from a car like well it's just like constant,
Yeah.
and then like oh look at this sweet tender moment like oh look at all these like people with autism. It's like oh I just found that very kind of sickening,
Yeah, no,
honestly.
it's funny. Everything you mentioned is exactly how I felt about their films on first watch. I was not a fan. I saw Good Time in
Okay.
theaters. I was offended. I saw Uncut Gems right when it came out, and I was just like, I just don't get it. I just don't get it. What are these films?
I wasn't offended. I just rolled my eyes. If that
Sure.
makes sense.
Oh, sure. But
But
the thing is, I think all the things you talk about are the way people view these movies as these relentless thrillers with these crazy psychopathic characters. That is absolute. And actually, listen, Josh and Benny Safdie are the most interesting interviewers ever. And this is a big part where me learning about the intent totally unlocked their movies for me. Their movies are not meant to be thrillers, although they use genre convention to make them approachable. Their films are all character studies on ambition and about
I could, at least between those two films, I can definitely see that.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I can see that.
And they're so empathetic, but it's easy to miss that in the way that their films are so crazy, and
Well,
they bring like a yin and yang to the character, where it's both a critique, like, and a pretty damning critique in all their films, and
there's
also like
also a
a
call to
champion.
like human empathy, right?
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just human empathy, it's a very sensitive empathy to these types of characters that in a way all their movies are variations about them telling about their father, which is really weird. But it's all of them talking about what inspiration is, what
Right.
artistic drive is, and why art and like ambition are important.
So in that sense, I would say that maybe the difference between the Safdies and Aster, as I previously compared them, is sort of kind of the drive behind what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Is that like
Whereas,
I wouldn't say
okay.
anything is out of place in Uncut Gems and Good Time, although through your lens of viewing it as a thriller and most people's lens, absolutely there are things that don't work and they could work better as genre pictures. But in terms of conceptual
yes,
pieces,
yes, but even if you just kind of view it as a drama, which you definitely can, don't get me wrong, and I'm not really surprised by that.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like it's still using these genre conventions, and honestly, like the way it uses them, I don't really particularly care for in a lot of
That's
ways.
fine. Yeah, and
I
that's
think and I think sometimes it can undermine like the more kind of like dramatic element of it.
sure, absolutely, and I understand that, and that's just your sensitivity to it. But to me, everything clicks immaculate in their pictures, and like, and it's funny because viewing them before, I didn't get them, and I just felt at a distance, and I didn't feel it. But now,
Well,
through understanding these characters, they're suddenly so gripping to me, and they're the most invigorating films to watch for me, and not
okay,
just
yeah, well,
anxiety inducing, but like inspiring.
right. I guess to call myself out, the ways that I was sort of criticizing like Hereditary and Uncut Gems and Good Time, like
Yeah.
I can probably say the similar thing about like Gaspar Noé's Climax,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
like it's a lot of like crazy, but that's the thing, like sometimes it's like, well, I may like have like a certain idea in my mind of like this is why I don't really care for this, but then I think, well, hold on a second, wait a second, back up. Why is it that I like this film by this director that somebody could easily call me out for? So I
Yeah.
think about that, but then I think like, well, ultimately, I think the difference is sort of kind of like the intentions behind it.
Yeah, and the sensitivities, yeah.
But not just the intentions behind it. Sometimes it's also like, do I think the shock value or kind of like the unrelentless kind of like nature of it,
Yeah.
do I think that it's worthy of my individual engagement?
Yeah.
And but that's determined by so many different factors,
Yeah.
based off of what is actually shown on the screen.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, yeah, I think it is just subjective judgment value.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
right?
And I just don't want you to make the same mistake I did at first, because now they're far and away my favorite modern directors. I think some point I wanted to bring up about the way it uses convention earlier is like, why would I excuse certain deficiencies in a certain movie that would apply to a different movie? And I think like, sure, you could cut Good Time or Uncut Gems to be something like Parasite. Parasite is a film you have any suspicions about, any sort of, ideas. The film has every single machination to never lose your suspension of disbelief, to never lose your engagement, and to appeal to any sort of preconceptions going in, which doesn't make
I
it a
like
bad film.
Parasite.
Yeah, no,
I love
Parasite's a cool
Parasite.
film,
I
but
think Parasite's great, actually.
say like yeah, definitely, but that's the thing, is that I'm not willing to care as much about Parasite because, again, with me, just my individual little things, Parasite doesn't speak as much to personal passion, ambition, and those are things I have a much stronger sensitivity to than
Hmm.
what Parasite articulates.
Okay, I see where you're coming from.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can see where you're coming from.
yeah, so that's just the justification for like why certain elements in a film are excusable in a way, you know.
But something that I'd also like to bring to your attention now,
Mm,
and I'm sure you probably thought about this to some extent,
yeah,
but it's like just because sometimes we're interested in different things at different times in our life,
yeah,
and that's just the case. And sometimes we watch certain movies like this is exactly what I need, but then you rewatch it later, and it's like, yeah, it's good. I know why I loved it before, but it's like I'm just not as into it at the moment.
sure,
It happens, and that's
yeah,
totally fine. And when I think like, but then it's like, you can watch a movie and you're just not in the mood. But it's like you kind of recognize in your mind, like, yeah, this is a good movie. Because ideally, in a setting where I'm a bit more interested in that certain topic, or kind of like emotionally there, I would recognize that as what I think is like really quality, you
yeah,
know? So we do have like our own kind of like perspectives of quality based off of kind of like kind of like outside of our own like immediate like experience, right?
yeah,
Because of the way that we kind of engage with art.
yeah,
You know, like it's true. Like I often have cited like Stalker as one of my favorite films, but like I don't find myself talking about it that often, honestly. I
yeah,
don't, Simon Tarkovsky, and I don't find myself rewatching it that often.
yeah,
But it's like, do I respect it the most? He probably out of some of the films, yeah.
yeah,
But also it's just sometimes I'm just not interested in watching Andrei Tarkovsky.
yeah,
Sometimes I'm not as interested in watching Stanley Kubrick. I think he's great. I think they're
exactly,
both great. Sometimes I'm not as interested in watching Ingmar Bergman
yeah,
or Jean-Luc Godard. But like I think I'll still think they're great at the end of the day.
yeah,
I think ultimately, with some reservations towards like some 80s films that millennials can't let go of, films before the 2000s, probably before the new millennium,
yeah,
the ones that are like classic and stuff, I think I like just about every one of them.
yeah,
The ones that are acclaimed, but for the most part, I'll have some hot takes here and there, but like, but at the core of the day, I do recognize kind of like the general cultural canon. I view it as good, and I think like it's also like not necessarily our duties as people who are interested in film to like watch everything, but I think like it's sort of interesting to kind of like engage with culture and kind of like and kind of understand where like people are coming from.
yeah.
But at the same time, you should sort of like broaden that, and you should maybe still challenge that kind of like status quo of what the culture is. You
Yeah.
know?
Like I view that like cultural context the same thing as like if you are to consider yourself, I think that's what makes a quote unquote cinephile or someone like interested in that, is that you are invested in the medium and how this stuff evolves. So you won't know the scope unless you look at these broad works like by Tarkovsky, Bergman, Bresson, Godard, whatever. But it's only natural that these broad films, they'll give you a great idea of the links of the medium, the where more films can more specifically go. You're going to develop your own preferences, your own personal proclivities, and then your taste will become much more singular. You're going to move away from those films. So I think that's only natural, and it does not speak to the quality of those films necessarily, you know?
Yes, sometimes. Yeah, I agree for the most part, but sometimes also I think it's always important that the more, the older you get, you kind of still broaden your horizons. And sometimes I think it's also good to kind of step outside of your immediate interests and
Oh yeah.
and especially culture. I think
Yeah.
it's very important to like watch like quote foreign films, for
Yeah.
example. And my story with that is like I became an English tutor in my undergraduate years, and I was tutoring a lot of international students at the same time I was watching like movies from their countries, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I started really kind of broadening my own like cultural like understandings. Eventually I dated somebody outside of that wasn't originally from America
Yeah.
also, and it's like, and eventually it's like it just kind of like I didn't realize how um unconsciously like kind of like national, not nationalistic, but kind of
But like
like kind of like
limited.
unconsciously like patriotic and kind of like and naive like my own views of the world war, because I just didn't see much outside of it before that. And I would definitely say I've grown considerably since. I think film is definitely kind of like this kind of like beautiful art form that constantly evolves. But I think like ultimately the main hesitation I have with completely agree with what you're saying is I think you're almost like kind of singular, making it too much of a singular individual experience. And my question is this: should cinema especially considering like the traditional like the theater, it's a bunch of like chairs.
Mhm.
Should cinema not be a shared experience? I think it probably should be.
I,
Obviously,
I
we're having
think
this
both are
discussion right
valid.
now. We're having this discussion right now, and I think like don't get me wrong. Most of the times I watch films, I watch them alone, right?
Oh, I'm the opposite.
Um,
Most of the time I watch films, I watch with other people, and it's funny because now we're coming at with the opposite perspectives. Where you're looking at film, you want it to be the shared experience, and I'm always watching film with other people, and I'm interested in what I'm internalizing.
Right, but instead of it's kind of like, yeah, no, yeah, no, yeah, it's just that's how it goes sometimes.
Yeah,
Also, like I know a lot of people when the pandemic hit, like they were basically not watching like they were basically watching a lot of movies, right?
yeah,
Because the pandemic just hit.
hmm
For me, because I just kind of like stopped watching them as much, and I still haven't completely left that slump.
hmm
I became more interested in writing about them, but like I couldn't get into that headspace because I couldn't have like that as a balance to anything else because it just was like my life where it's like I don't have much to do and I don't want to do this, I don't have the motivation.
yeah.
And so sometimes like we, I don't know. I think like ultimately there's a lot of value to be had with the kind of like the art form, but at the
Yeah,
same time I think also it has a lot of like negative like influences on culture too.
sure,
I would
yeah.
not trade it, but at the same time and I know Zach was saying this too, but basically like kind of like film may lead to like murder and death and stuff. You look at something like The Birth of a Nation. I know that you'll like D.W. Griffith, but
Mhm.
like regardless of whatever Griffith's like misguided intentions were with the film, and whether like it actually really revitalized the KKK is a whole other story. But
Yeah.
like, but at any rate, it was at least used as a form of propaganda. It was at least used as evil, you know.
Mm.
And I mean, I'm very critical of like kind of like the Iraq War and stuff, and 300 as much as I like Zack Snyder and as much as I like that film, like
Yeah.
that was still screened for soldiers to kind of like prep them like yeah go out there kill some Arabs and
Yeah.
no it's terrible that's ultimately kind of the way that but art is just a reflection of culture too. It's
Mhm.
not always like it's not necessarily an instruction manual all the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's kind of just more like things are going to be co-opted regardless. You're going to have idiots that look at Starship Troopers and somehow think it's actually
Yeah.
pro-Nazi,
hmm
and they're going to run with that, and they're just like, I don't know. It's like should we blame the movie as always?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, not necessarily, but at the same time, like if it's not that movie, it was going to be something else. If it
Exactly.
wasn't Birth of a Nation, it would something else would have taken its place.
Yeah.
If Triumph of the Will wasn't made, they would have just had somebody else make something that was pretty much the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like, somebody else would have done it.
Yeah.
That's the way I look at all this.
No,
You
absolutely.
know,
Man, you brought so many points. Like you bring up like 4 points I'm super passionate about. I'm just like, oh shit, I gotta cover all this. But I think the first one is something I kind of wanted to make sure wasn't misconstrued in my first episode was that and also what I just said with the when I talk about honing sensibilities, I don't mean limiting yourself to certain things. I just mean you'll both have a broader palette and have a deeper understanding of the things. Like for example, like with music, like I feel like I've went through a great deal of the rock music canon, and now I'm starting to branch out into like early hip hop, and it's really opening up to me and stuff. And these are cultural contexts I have no
right.
familiarity with, but through just a sensitivity to like sound and the way LPs are made and stuff, that helps me engage with those things. Which again, it provides a gateway to these cultures that I'm unfamiliar with,
Right.
which is great. What I warn against is people who don't have those sensitivities, haven't really engaged with the canon, just going and like watching a bunch of foreign films thinking this will make them look smart, when really
Oh,
it's like
right.
they're
Like
tourists, you know?
right. It's a very weird trade I've seen only on Letterboxd and Twitter, and I guess
Yeah,
Discord just by extension.
yeah,
It is like people like especially kind of like either young teenagers or people in their young 20s. They'll they'll basically just like watch they'll skip like Sunset Boulevard
yeah,
and they'll go straight to like Satan Tango or
yep,
something. It's like where is this coming from? Because they want to be as esoteric and like popular. That's what it is.
yeah,
It's kind of like the desire to impress, the desire kind of for
hmm
clout, even find it in whatever way possible.
yeah,
But the thing is, I see like all these Zoomer kids that are into films, and they approach it the same way they approach philosophy and politics, which is very
hmm
kind of shallow. But but people ought to start somewhere, right?
yeah,
People come to express themselves in different ways and also try to find interest. But then they also get into these weird like kind of hive mind circles where it's like yes, this is great, like base. But I don't think it's very like historically people would base their morals and kind of outlook on life on whether is this right or wrong, is this
Yeah.
good or bad. But now it's like is this based or cringe? And I think that that's just not a healthy way to look at life. But I see this
Absolutely.
manifest in different forms. And luckily, I see some of these people like over the last couple of years that they sort of grow out of it too. They kind of find their own, and maybe they had to have kind of like the little community to kind of like really get there. But it's so weird to me that there were teenagers out there that will watch an 8-hour Hungarian film before they'll watch like a classic piece of like kind of like Hollywood with
Absolutely.
like Marilyn Monroe or something. That's crazy to me.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, I didn't really get, I was into films for, during my teenage years, but I didn't really watch that much until I turned 18. I went to college because I'm like, well, hey, now's the time to see all these movies on the shelf. Let me just start watching them.
Yeah.
And then I remember I was like, all right, I just should watch more foreign films. And then I'm like, you know, I was watching Ingmar Bergman. I was watching like Steven Spielberg. I checked out like David Fincher and all those like people that everybody starts with. Stanley Kubrick, love the guy.
Yeah.
2001's great. You're wrong about that. But then
That's
also
okay.
like there's they get like I watched like Battleship Potemkin. I thought I approached it in a way where I'm like, yeah, this is gonna be kind of cute to today's standards. I didn't really watch many silent films. Then suddenly I'm like, oh wow, this is way more violent and kind of intense than I thought.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, like it brought me to tears because I really started engaging with it because I'm
Yeah.
like, oh. And even if it's like Soviet propaganda, state funded, and all that, like it doesn't matter. There's like kind of like beyond that. It's almost like kind of engaging with the medium in a new way. Because Eisenstein was really trying to push it forward. He may have done it through state propaganda,
Yeah.
but at the end of the day, like it's kind of like read between the lines. What is he as an individual beyond kind of the system that he works under? Is actually saying maybe beyond the what's still political, but beyond the kind of the political instructions that he's kind of follows.
Yeah.
What is he saying between the lines about the
Yeah.
film itself, right? But it is intrinsically linked, and it's kind of like it's still connected. But
Sure.
like
But
it's an interesting. But then also like Eisenstein went on to make things like Ivan the Terrible, that basically kind of like went against like Stalin and like and all those other guys. But it's like but that was like intended to kind of be sort of somewhat propagandic too and kind of like but it's like it's self-critical. So then I'm started thinking like, hey, is there something between the lines in Potemkin like where
yeah.
he's actually sort of like kind of like countering a lot of this? I would argue that maybe there is. And I think that brings a whole level of new engagement to the text.
Yeah.
Just like you could view that with so many different texts. And I think like you can honestly kind of like some people will comment on like my Star Wars video, and Star Wars fans are a whole other thing, but
Yeah.
like they will be like, yeah, this is so great. Like you made this so complex. That's great. And it's like your analysis is so complex and this movie is so complex. It's like, yeah, it is, and I agree with that, and I think it's good too. But at the same time, I also think you could still apply this to like something I don't like Force Awakens. You can twist analysis in that way.
Yeah.
You can make something appear good. You can always do that, I feel like.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think the complexity does not necessarily equate to quality.
Yeah.
Some people will act like it does. People will act like complexity equates to quality, but only when it suits them and not when
Yeah.
it comes to things that they know that they don't like. But what I find interesting about like a little tangential, but I kind of just got into the topic because I was thinking about George Lucas. George Lucas, there's Zack Snyder, there's M. Night Shyamalan. These are all people that kind of like, they made some films that people liked, but then at the end of the day, that they were sort of kind of like
Ostracized.
seen as also the Wachowskis as well.
Oh
They're
yeah.
seen as kind of these Hollywood filmmakers that basically they're they make popular movies, but then they fell out of favor from people.
Yeah.
Why? Because they have their own individual identity.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
They don't conform to kind of the recognized order of things in a lot of ways. They still they still make things that are crowd pleasing to some extent, but there's still like somewhat of a divide, and I find that very fascinating. Because like people would turn on like Shyamalan stuff, but like I think some of his movies aren't good, but like but I think the vast majority of them actually are.
Absolutely, yeah.
Same goes, and like that's just how it is, and but I think I'd rather appreciate things for kind of being more unique but even creativity and uniqueness does not necessarily make a work good necessarily either. What it really comes down to is kind of like my own, like, at least for me, my own perceptions of whether I liked it or not. And in addition to that, my, even if I don't always like to admit it, kind of my own recognition of what I personally believe to be good in terms of quality.
Yeah. No, that's a great way to put it. And hearing you say that was so cathartic, because what you were expressing there about, gaining a sensitivity to things and then being so moved by Battleship Potemkin and understanding how Eisenstein as an individual was slanting these things, portraying these things in a way that transcended this sort of context. That's what I mean by a universal truth, to make this full circle. Like that.
I just don't know if I would call it universal.
Sure, it's a shitty phrase.
Yeah, but anyway, I know what you're saying though. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's just like, I think it's the sensitivity, like he understands these things. He has insights into things, into people that are much more nuanced than simple propaganda, simple like functional cinema for direct means. He wants to put forth something that is more essential to what people do. And I think that's the point of art, is to preserve that, to be drawn on forever. So that, like would he have imagined that 90 some years from now, some college kid would be crying to this film? But that's the beauty of art, and that's what inspiration and all that is. Yeah. No, that was absolutely great what you touched on. And yeah, I mean, it's almost like a good place to kind of wrap this up.
That's what I was thinking.
I'm tired, you tired. Jesus wept.